Hi. Oh, week 9, book 9. And this time it is the fifth book of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. And this one is called The Prisoner. Now, I think I said last time, I was talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, that this is as far as I've ever gotten in Proust before, and it's true. The first time I read it, I got about maybe, I don't know, 100 or so odd pages into um, Sodom and Gomorrah, and didn't even get to The Prisoner. So this time I finished The Prisoner and moving on. So, what do we have to say about this book? Well, first of all, I want to backtrack a little bit. In Sodom and Gomorrah, along with the strangeness about um, uh, Baron Charlot and his relationship with Morel, and uh, the main character's obsession with whether or not all the this or that member of uh, French society was gay or lesbian. In addition to that, goodness, all kind of pop-ups here. Go away. Okay. So, in addition to that, um, there was also quite an obsession with place names. Now, you might recall that this kind of obsession with place names started out early on in the first book as well, in Swan's Way, and was repeated in the shadow of Young Girls in Blossom, or whatever that book was called, in Bloom or something. Well, we've got the same kind of concern going on here, only this time we have one of the minor characters in the book is going around talking about how all of these names and where they really come from. Okay, now this is, I think, one of the first places in the book where it being translated from French probably hurts the way that it reads in potentially important ways. Because he's talking about all of these names that seem to have a very obvious derivation in French. Okay, but this minor character is providing different etymologies and different backgrounds. And part of what's going on here, I think, is there is, throughout this entire thing, sort of a search for the authentic self, for the authentic being, for authenticity altogether. And you can think about this too in terms of some of the ideas of the sexuality of the time, and this notion of the invert and that sort of thing. And this idea that sexuality was not just the commission of a sexual act; it was some kind of core identity. And this was an idea that had first sort of broached itself in Western culture in the 1880s, 1890s, the decadence, as it's called. In that period, Oscar Wilde was a part of that. Oscar Wilde, very famously, went to jail for 2 years for hard labor because he denied that he was a sodomite, I believe was what it was called. I'm not exactly sure, but what happened was he was in a club, and somebody gave him a note. The father of his boyfriend gave him a note calling him a sodomite, and Oscar Wilde sued him for libel. But his lover's father happened to be very well connected and wealthy, and was able to muster quite a bit of evidence. And you can read the trial transcripts, and well, Oscar Wilde was gay, and the evidence was pretty damning in the sense of, like, he definitely had done this, and not damning in the sense that there's anything wrong with it. That's not the point. I'm not making any judgment calls on things. I'm just pointing out that the evidence was there. And Oscar Wilde either felt that his reputation would weather it, or that the evidence wasn't there, or that maybe there was, some sense of a crusade to get rid of these anti-sodomy laws and begin to normalize homosexuality. I'm not really sure what was on Oscar Wilde's mind, but it was, in terms of his life, a great miscalculation. He wound up being found guilty and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, and after he got out, he lived in Paris for another 5 years and passed away. Okay, so that's all background, but that's happening at the time in which this book is set. Not when he wrote it now, not when he wrote it, but in the time it is set. It is set somewhere around 1900, maybe just a few years after that event. That event isn't mentioned in the book that I know of, but, this idea of finding the authentic, finding the self, finding what one really is and who other people are, pervades the book and goes back down, like I said here, to even the etymology of place names. Why are things called what they are? What is the what is the origin of these words? What is the origin of this language? And this, of course, goes back with French being a Romance language, going back to some kind of derivation of Latin. And a language like Spanish and a language like Italian being sort of sister languages in the same complex of languages. All of this begins to inform what's going on here. And there's lengthy, lengthy, lengthy passages of this character going on and on and on about this location and this name and that name and where it comes from and all this sorts of things. And remember, this has been an obsession with this character, with Marcel, the main character, for a while, in terms of why things are called what they are, why things are named as they are, and how the names of things cohere or not to the objects that they're named. Okay, this has been a philosophical conundrum since the time of Plato. Plato was one of the first I know of, to really write fairly extensively about how things are named. And he had a particular view on this, and other philosophers had particular views. The two basic views are either the names of things are basically arbitrary, or they are ultimately based in the sound, sort of the automatopoeia of the thing itself. And there's some evidence both ways with some words, and you can make what you want to of it. It's like the Egyptian hieroglyphs and that sort of thing, how originally they looked like the thing that they supposedly represent, and that becomes more stylized and more abstract, and then takes on meanings that aren't there in the present concrete word, etc. And this is even thought to have led to the way the alphabet looks in the Phoenician alphabet and the alphabet we use today, and those kinds of things, and etc. So all of that, how things get named, why, is it convention? Is it just convention? Do we just call things what they are through convention? Or does it go back to some soul, some core of what the thing is? Now, we get to the prisoner. The prisoner, on the surface of it, is Albertine. Because Marcel has decided that he cannot trust Albertine to not go after women. That apparently in his mind, lesbianism is some kind of compulsion that a young woman like Albertine has. And so the only way to prevent her from seeking liaisons with other young women is to prevent her from being around other young women. And the only way to do that is to actually keep her as a prisoner in his house. Now, she's a prisoner, but more a prisoner of convention than any kind of guards or walls or anything like that. Yes, Marcel is there to kind of keep her there, and Francois is there as kind of a little bit of a warden. But really, Albertine would theoretically be able to leave anytime she wanted to. It's just there's a social cost for a young woman living in a man's house who she's not married to. And technically it's not Marcel's house. Technically it's his mother's house, but his mother isn't there. His mother has gone off elsewhere. So she's basically living with Marcel. Now, exactly how far their physical relationship goes is something of a question. And I suspect that this is one of the issues in the book that Proust may not have clarified to the extent that he might have had he lived to finish the book. This is the first one that was not published in his lifetime. And so the version of it that we have here is not necessarily entirely what Proust would have intended. We don't know what he would have changed or how he would have changed it. So we unfortunately just have what we have. So whether or not they actually had full intercourse or whether or not they just played sex games or somewhere in between, we simply don't know. It's the language is a little vague and unclear. Now maybe somebody who is very versed in the conventions of how French was used at the time, maybe somebody who's read extensively in Proust's correspondence that he left behind and the manuscripts could answer that question definitively. All I can tell you is with the English version, with this version, it's not entirely clear. Does it matter? That's a good question. You know, it's a good question how much that matters. Because Marcel does obsess about her and about her sexuality. And like I said, he prevents her from going to places to see other women. And he also does this subterfuge where he keeps spying on her through various people, through Andre, sometimes one of her female friends, through some of her social circle, through the chauffeur of her car, and other people. And he keeps getting mixed messages, but he also perhaps is descending into a bit of paranoia here. And again, things a little unclear, but as I said, Albertine is technically the prisoner here. And throughout this book is basically one big, long diatribe about Marcel being obsessed with keeping Albertine to himself, even though he doesn't really claim to love her and doesn't really want her. He just wants to prevent her from going out with anyone else and being with anyone else. And he seems very conflicted about it and, you know, quite frankly, just a controlling piece of crap, which has got to be, at least on some level, intentional on the part of Proust. So what's going on here? Well, I think what might be fruitful is to think about the Hegelian master-slave or master-servant dialectic in phenomenology of spirit. Now, the way this works is you have two individuals who are both conscious and they want to be self-conscious, and they come into conflict with each other, and that's how you find self-consciousness, through somebody else's consciousness. So they come into conflict in a life and death struggle, apparently. And in this life and death struggle, one of them wins and becomes the master, and the other one becomes the servant or slave. Now, the master could, at that moment, when they're ascendant, could kill the servant or the slave, but they don't want to do that because it's only through the recognition of the self, of the master's self, from the servile point of view, that the master will have self-consciousness. Okay, and so that is what they are apparently seeking from Hegel's abstract, weird point of view. Okay, so, but because the master controls the servant and doesn't see the servant as entirely autonomous and as a person, but more as an it, they cannot get what they want from them because they don't see the servant as a full other, and the master needs them to be a full other. Meanwhile, the servant, who is going out doing the master's bidding, has direct contact with the world, with vitality, with the things of the world, and because of that, the servant, ironically, has more of a self-identity than the master does. Okay, in sort of weird kind of way, the servant becomes the one who controls the master in some extent. The servant is the one who defines the master. A master is one who has servants. Therefore, the master is dependent on the servant. The servant, however, is not dependent on the master. The servant does not need the master to exist. The master needs the servant. Okay, so Marcel master, Albertine, servant. And so there is this struggle between the two of them. And Albertine, who is the prisoner, who is the one who is servile, becomes the one who controls Marcel, controls the master through exactly this kind of back and forth and this kind of process. And so where Marcel is trying to to create mastery over Albertine, instead he is consistently making her the master of him by needing to control her. It's all very weird and complicated, and you know, about as dysfunctional as you can possibly get. I mean, call me old-fashioned, but in my world, in my consciousness, if I want you to be with me, I'm going to tell you, and if you want me to be with you, you're going to tell me, and we are going to come together as equals, and we're not going to struggle for dominance and have this sort of crazy love romance games. We're just going to be who we are. But hey, that's who I am. That's that's what 21st century America has. What this period in France had, it might have been different. What Proust wanted to explore might have been different. And there is a way in which this is possibly critiquing patriarchy and critiquing masculinity. There's a way in which this isn't necessarily intended to be valorized. There's all kinds of things. And anyway, so I might come back to The Prisoner again, but that's just what I wanted to say at first about this. And yeah, I will say that I do enjoy these books. They are an interesting read. They're long, they're complicated. Don't do this if you can't read like 2 or 3 page paragraphs. If 2 or 3 page paragraphs scare you off, try something else first, because this is a thick book and very obsessively about the same topic over and over and over and over again. So, I'm leaving out quite a bit of the detail of that development of the self, but that's inevitable because it's so minutely dissected page after page after page after page. I mean, literally page after page after page after page. So, all right.